It is the day of Reformation, and today we celebrate the Reformation. So I would like to speak on the book of Habakkuk, the reading that we had in the Old Testament, also the reading in the New Testament, and the words that spark this Reformation. The just shall live by faith. Martin Luther made Habakkuk. That's the title of our sermon. Martin Luther was born in a very exciting yet dark time. It was a time of giants. It was a time when Gutenberg revolutionized the printing press. Martin Beheim designed the first globe. They used power in ammunition. The pocket watch was invented. Leonardo da Vinci invented, among so many other things, the pump and the flying machine. Columbus, well, he arrived in the Americas. Vasco da Gama did his sea route journey. Michelangelo was born just a few years prior to Martin Luther. It was the aftermath of the Black Death, which killed at least 1/3 of Europe's population. It was interesting times. And during this time of which all these things were happening in an obscure town, Martin Luther was born on 10 November 1483. It was time when people in Europe worked very hard to make a living. Death rates were very high. The average lifespan was about 40 years old. The greatest worries of parents during that time was to not being able to provide food for their family. And we find the Luther family. And in this time, little Martin was born. It was a dark time as well, amongst all these new inventions, exciting things that were happening, the breach from the medieval, the Dark Ages, to a better time. But it was also the time when the church of that time let people down. It was a very dark time for the church. People like you and me couldn't read the Bible. It was not possible. It was only the theologians, the priests, who had access to the Bible. So people during that time also had the same question, I think, that many of us have today, but more so in that time. Where is God in all this pain and all this darkness around them? So when Martin Luther was born, his parents wanted him not be confined to that small world of them. They wanted him to be a lawyer. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, so he sent him off to university, something that was quite rare for his standing in society those days. We know the story of Martin Luther. It's been told so many times. But he was a brilliant student, so he went off to university, and in record time he received his bachelor, and after that his master's. And then he had this incredible experience where he was en route, and it was a very fierce thunderstorm. And we know the story where he fell down. He was nearly struck by lightning. He fell down on his face on the ground, and he called to Saint Anna, the patron saint of the miners. And he said to her, well, if I get through this, if I don't die, I will become a monk. And so he did. He joined the monastery. And in the monastery, he poured himself merciless out to be a monk and to be everything what he called monkery could be. He said himself, if monkery, that's to be a monk and the actions of a monk, his own word, if monkery could get people to heaven, I would have been the first. He had this inner struggle to find peace with God. His problem with his father, because his father was merciless, his father was never to be satisfied, always criticizing him, and no less his mother was the same. So his fear for his father, his fear for his mother, the insecurity he transferred to God when becoming a monk, when giving his life to the church. So that was Martin Luther. At some point, he was sent to Rome. On his way to Rome, he fell ill. And later, when he recovered, he set off and he continued his journey. And then he came into Rome and he visited the St. John Chapel, where the Santa Scala was the set of stairs, 28 stairs, that they claim was miraculously transferred from Jerusalem to Rome. How it happened, only they knew. It was a time of relics. It was a time where people would pray to whatever relics they were, the hair of Mary, the toenail of somebody, and they would do anything just to go to these churches. There was one church, for instance, it was very interesting. This church claimed to have had the skull of John the Baptist. And then at some day, there was a tourist, and he was looking at the skull, what is supposed to be the skull of John the Baptist, and he said, but I just came from Jerusalem, and there's another church who also claimed to have the skull of John the Baptist, but that skull is quite smaller than this one. So the tour guide told him, well, not to outdo his own embarrassment, he said, well, that was when John was still a bit younger. So this was a time of relics. The 28 steps were claimed to have been the steps of Pilate, where Jesus would have walked up, and it was claimed that still some of his blood spats were there, and they had some kind of a little box over the blood spats, and people were crawling up every step. They prayed. To the next step they prayed, and as you could see in the slide, they still do it today. And then they would stand or sit there at the relic places where the blood spats would have been, and they would pour out their hearts, and they would flagellate themselves. And so that was a religion of doing. And it is said that, and this is from a letter by Martin Luther to his son, it was said that when he was climbing up those steps, when he was crawling up those steps, flagellating, he was praying, he was trying everything to please God. He said 3 times during that journey, there was the impulse in his heart, the words of Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. He said, when I get to the next step, the words of Habakkuk rang in my heart again and again. The just shall live by faith. He said the 3rd time, the just shall live by faith. He said, I got up and I felt as if new life was born. I was born anew. I wonder if Habakkuk ever thought that these words of him penned down so many years prior would have sparked such a revolution. You see, Habakkuk lived in times where the world was dark as well. It was a time where corruption was all over the country. It was a time when Habakkuk has cried out to God, and yet God answered him. Habakkuk, you won't understand everything. Habakkuk, you're trying to understand God. You're trying so hard to wrestle with God. But Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. It was a turning point in his prophecy. It was a turning point in Paul's life. It was a turning point in Luther's life. These days, we're busy in the morning services looking at Habakkuk. And I'm thinking a lot about Habakkuk. I read it and I feast on it and I think it over. And when I read this again, in my heart, I saw a similarity between Habakkuk and Luther. You see, the name of Habakkuk, as we saw a few weeks earlier, the name of Habakkuk is very significant. You can interpret his name in three words. Habakkuk the wrestler, Habakkuk the clinger, Habakkuk the embracer. And I see the same progression in the life of Luther. The progression in Habakkuk's life was according to his name. In Habakkuk, the first chapter, he was wrestling with God. Habakkuk, the second chapter, he was clinging to God. Habakkuk, the third chapter, he was embracing God. If I look at the life of Luther, I see the same. The first part of his life, he was a wrestler. Maybe not a wrestler so much with God, but with salvation. It's a wrestler with that lack of peace in his soul, this turmoil in his soul. Luther, as we said, was born to Hans. His father, his mother, Marguerite. His father was harsh. He was a harsh disciplinarian. There was no soft upbringing. He said of his father that he was ruled with an iron fist. He said, my father once whipped me so hard, I ran away, I hated him. He said his mother whipped him for stealing a nut until the blood flowed. And that same view of his parents, he transferred to God. And God became the disciplinarian. God became the one who was never satisfied. God was this fire of God which you could never, ever satisfy. So Martin Luther tried his best. He was sleeping outside in the snow. He went to confession so many times that the Father Superior once told him, Martin, please go out and sin so that you have something to confess about. Just go and sin, do something, then come back. He was wrestling with his own soul. He had no time for the people around him. Had no time for anything else but this wrestling, this struggle with God. And strangely, if you read his life story, he was in good company. I read in the Bible that they were also wrestlers with God. Jacob was a wrestler with God. Moses wrestled with God. David, if you read the Psalms that describe to David, he was wrestling with God. I read that Jesus was wrestling with his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. Please let this cup pass from me. He was sweating blood. Paul was wrestling with God. And I think we all are wrestling with God. If we're not really wrestling with God, maybe we're wrestling with something of God. Maybe you also have that struggle with whatever your identity. Maybe with who you are. Maybe you struggle. How can I please God? How can God love me? Maybe your struggle is with so many other things. Maybe your struggle is to understand why. How? What is God doing in your life? We all have some kind of thing that we wrestle. What are you wrestling with? Maybe I can ask you this question, a Reformation question. Do you have peace with God? When I was a very young child, I remember my first question to God as a child. I was 5 or 6 years old. And we were at a funeral of some person that we knew. And I remember very clearly, even today, and that was many, many, many years ago, I remember that at the grave I was asking my father, where is she now? Because we went to church. Is she in heaven or hell? My father says, we don't know. We hope she's up. And I was asking myself, so what about I? Where will I be if I die? And I wrestled with God as a child with that. Not remotely the same as did Luther. What are you wrestling with? And then from wrestling, he became a clinger. From the wrestler, he moved, he progressed to be the clinger, clinging to God. He went to Rome, and Rome was a cesspool. It was a pit of prostitution and profanity. He said, and he wrote this down, no one can imagine what sins and infamous actions are committed in Rome. They must have been seen and heard to be believed. But still, he went to the Pilate's staircase on his knees, and he says, while I was ascending the staircase, I heard a voice. The just shall live by faith. Later on, he would go back to the scriptures and he would write about it, he would lecture about it. In Romans, we would find it 3 times in the New Testament. In Romans, the emphasis is on just. The just shall live by faith. And he would realize the just is not what I do to be righteous with God, but what God has done in Christ. So if I'm in Christ, I'm part of the just before God. One can say much about this. The righteous, the just, is a legal term. It is to be declared just. I cannot be righteous on my own. I'm a sinner. That's why I need Christ. Because Christ is the one that makes me just before God. In him, I'm right before God. So he fled into Christ. He found his refuge in Christ. And that is what we sang about this afternoon in our opening hymn. The just. In Hebrews, he found that the emphasis is on shall live. Not maybe, not perhaps, but the just shall live. It is a fact. He shall live. In Habakkuk, that word for live means to survive, to outlive chaos. Isn't that beautiful? outlive chaos, to appear out of this chaos as a whole. But this live also means that it's progression, it is continuation, it is I shall live every single day. I shall live by faith, living. And this life, it is life with a capital L. I shall have that kind of life. Not simply surviving, but I shall prosper. I shall have purpose. In Christ, the just shall live by faith. And in Galatians, he found the faith part of this text to be emphasized. By faith. Not by works. Not by trying so hard. By faith. And faith means to open your hands and open your arms to God and just take faith. Not by what I see, not by what I feel, not by what I understand, but by faith. Habakkuk had to learn this because his circumstances didn't change, but he changed. So Luther became a clinger. This verse was the cross for him. This verse was for him the lifeline, and he clung unto that. He grabbed hold of it. And then the last, he became the embracer. See, from wrestler to clinger to be the embracer. You see, a child. If a child is in danger, he is scared, well, he panicked. And then he might cling to my hand. If it was my child, he would cling to my hand, and then I would pick him up. And as I pick him up, he would put his arms around me. He would embrace. You see, Habakkuk was a wrestler with his whys and his whats and his not understanding God. He was clinging to what God said to him, and in the end, in Habakkuk, the 3rd chapter, he was free. He found God, and God found him. It didn't matter anymore the circumstances. He found God. The same with Luther. All that struggle eventually culminates in him embracing God. And by embracing God, he had first to feel God embracing him, the embracer. You see, for Habakkuk, God said, you will not always understand what I'm doing. You will not always have the answers, but on the wings of faith, you will fly. You will be the one that live by faith. Wonderful here. Again, the words of Luther. Before those words broke upon my mind, he says, I hated God. And I was angry with him because not content with frightening us sinners by the law and by the miseries of life, he still further increased our torture by the gospel. But when, by the Spirit of God, I understood these words, the just shall live by faith, I felt born again like a new man. I entered through the open doors of the very paradise of God. I saw the beloved and the Holy Scriptures with other eyes. The words I had detested previously, I began from that hour to value and to love as the sweetest and most consoling words in the Bible. For me, the true gate of paradise. the just shall live by faith. Not by sight, not by virtue, not by works, not by doctrine, not by understanding, not by wisdom, but by faith I shall live.